Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today for Resident Ownership 102. This is a EB PREC mini workshop explaining how the resident owner finances work. And EB PREC is the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. We launched in 2018 through a collaboration of the Peoples of Color Sustainable Housing Network and the Sustainable Economies Law Center. We now have 7 properties under management, 15 staff members, and we've been developing and tweaking our resident ownership model for the past few years. We finally have a template that we're excited to put out there, and we shared in Resident Ownership 101, an overview of our resident ownership model. We're launching this mini series to bring bite-sized snippets of how our model works to the public. And this Resident Ownership 102 is focused on the financial benefits for resident owners. So how does the financial portion of our structure work? If you want to get an overview of how resident ownership works overall, please check out Resident Ownership 101, which should be available online as well. So an overview of our model for folks who are new to it, and then we're going to zoom in right into financials. This is sort of a financial overview of how money flows in our co-op. So we, EB PREC, are funded by people through crowdfunding, and sometimes we take on loans from banks if we need to. But often we don't. We're crowdfunded by the people from community, and we purchase and manage properties that then the tenants, the residents there, get to become resident owners. They contribute financially to the property, and in return, they get equity and dividends returned back to them. So there's a financial return for residents, which obviously renters don't have. So that's what we're going to be zooming into today, around how that works. And we have a resident owner agreement template that I'll share with you. We'll put it in the notes for this video. And section 9 is the summary of financial benefits that you'll see in that resident owner agreement. And there's also a financial benefits policy that is linked there that will also drop into the video notes here. And there's a lot there. It's pretty complicated. There's legalese, and that's why we're creating this video to break it down in simpler terms. But if you're interested in resident ownership or want to understand how things work, please check it out. Part of why we're making this video is for folks who want to understand the nuts and bolts behind our model, how we make it work legally, how we make it work financially. And so that's why we're sharing all of this. So getting into it, there's really 2 ways that people can, there's 2 financial benefits that we provide for tenants. And this is the first one. I'm putting it here first because it's very simple in that it is a TBD, but we do commit in our bylaws to this compensation. So if a tenant or a resident owner, I should say, if a resident owner actually adds value by building or repairing something themselves, and we're not talking about if you repair, an outlet or something that's pretty minor. But if you were to build a new deck or repair fix your roof, if you're a roofer and you could bring those skills and do it yourself, we are able to provide fair compensation for that. And that could, we could pay you, obviously, the co-op could pay the resident for that work, or it could be in the form of equity. We don't have a detailed system for how to do that, but basically, we want residents to reach out to the cooperative first to come up with an agreement. So any compensation just needs to be approved beforehand. We need to look at the project, agree on, what the compensation is going to be, just like you would with any compensated project. So that is the first financial benefit that residents get, whereas renters wouldn't get any kind of compensation for that. Now we're going to get into the second kind of compensation, and I'm going to share some co-op terminology with you to move that along. So the co-op terminology is patronage dividends. And this is basically a refund, a rebate on profits that's based on how much the residents contributed to the co-op, or as it says here, based on how much business they conducted with the co-op. Now, business they conducted, that's in the example of a well-known co-op that uses this structure is REI. So the business that I conduct as a consumer with REI is I go and shop there. And then based on how much I shopped, based on how much business I did with them, I get a rebate at the end of the year, right? You get your little coupon that says, oh, you got 25 bucks at REI. And so that's a rebate that I can then spend at REI as a discount on my next purchase. Similarly, When you're a resident at EB PREC, a resident owner, you're paying each month towards the cooperative to sustain your property. You get a rebate on that, a refund, a distribution of any profits, any surplus based on how much you contributed in the year. So that's what a patronage dividend is. That's the sort of legal framework that this fits into, that our limited equity structure is really built around. And it's calculated at the end of the year by the co-op, and some of it's distributed to the resident, and some of it is held as equity in the co-op until they leave. And so we will get into those pieces. The financial benefits, just overall, it's an opt-in structure. So if you're a resident owner, but you don't want the financial benefits, you don't have to participate in them. You can still have the governance, shared decision-making power, all that kind of benefits of resident ownership without having to do the financial part, or the financial benefit part. But we do invite everybody to participate in it, and it's a sliding scale. But basically, so patronage dividends is a refund or rebate on surplus. And surplus is kind of cooperative language for profit. And this is how we calculate surplus. We take the resident contributions for that particular property, and we subtract all the costs related to that particular property. And that equals your surplus, right? Money in minus money out equals the money you got left over at the end, your surplus. There's actually two different kinds of costs that we need to differentiate between. One is your expenses. And this includes, sort of is operating expenses for your property insurance, your property taxes, your yearly repairs and maintenance. You put some aside for reserves each year. That's an expense. Utilities that are paid, costs of management. And there's other things that, depending on the property, you might be advertising vacancies, you might be paying for a landscaper. So those are your expenses. Aside from your expenses, the second type of costs, we had to sort of make up our own terminology for it. We're calling it the asset payment costs. Rolls right off the tongue, right? But basically, this is the money that you're paying to pay off the property. This could be if you have a mortgage on the property, you're repaying your lenders, right? We've also got investor owners at EB PREC. A lot of our money comes from people who buy shares in EB PREC, and we need to pay them back over time. And so we sort of attribute a portion of monthly payments from residents towards paying those investor owners back. That's a part of the asset payment costs. So this is really like the asset is the property, and a portion of the costs of this property is paying back the asset over time. So those are the two types of costs. Now, in regard to this asset payment cost, right? If we buy the building for $1 million, and we're paying back our lender and our investor owners $1 million over the course of, let's say, 30 years, this asset payment cost is going to add up to $1 million over the course of time. So back to the sliding scale, the resident owners get a portion of this asset payment cost back, right? They don't actually, not all of it gets subtracted from the surplus. Only a portion of it gets subtracted by the surplus because we want to share this equity with them. It's a limited equity. And this is where the residents get to choose on a sliding scale. Originally, we actually had 100% of this asset payment cost going back to the residents. This was our original vision for the model before we put anything in place. And we quickly realized that, oh, that means, we're basically like the co-op itself is never going to be building any equity in the property because we're always going to have to be paying all the equity back to the residents. And that means we're going to constantly be in more and more debt. And what if the roof needs a repair? Like it just isn't a sustainable long-term model to pay 100% of this back to the residents. So with 30%, we decided as the maximum. We invite our residents to choose on a scale of 0 to 30%. If you don't need to build equity, if you're financially okay, you can opt in for 0, and that will benefit the rest of the co-op at large. But if you want to build more equity, you can choose up to 30%. And as you pay down the value of the property, you're earning this amount of equity in the cooperative. So this is a more refined version of the surplus calculation. We take the resident contributions, the money in, and then the expenses, or minus the costs going out, right? Which includes the expenses and between 70 to 100% of the asset payment costs, depending on where you choose on that sliding scale. So then that gives you the surplus number. So to put that into a real world example here, let's say, for instance, we've got $10,000 per year that this resident contributed, $10,000 in a given year that they contributed to a property. through their monthly payments. And then in this example, let's assume there's $5,000 of expenses, right? Your property taxes, your insurance, your repairs and maintenance, etc. And then in this example, there's $6,000 of asset payment costs. So over time, the co-op paid down $6,000, or the resident contributed $6,000 towards asset payment costs. 75% of those costs would be subtracted from this. So that being $4,500. And then that leaves $500 worth of surplus. Yay. Now you'll note in this example, if we were to subtract 100% of the asset payment costs, that would be minusing $6,000 here instead of 4,500. There'd actually be a negative surplus. There'd be a negative $1,000 of surplus. So in this example, it shows how even though the property might have a loss for the year, the resident owner is still building some equity because the co-op is building equity and there is equity being built in the property. Ideally, financial contributions would be more than the total cost for the property in the year, and then the surplus would be even greater. On the other hand, if all of this, let's say we didn't subtract any of this asset payment, like I mentioned, our original model was going to be 100% of the asset payment costs get into equity for the resident owner as opposed to the co-op. That means we would be taking the financial contribution and only subtracting $5,000. So the resident owner would be building $5,000 worth of equity, even though we had to pay an additional $6,000 for the asset payment costs. So that's where it starts to get really unsustainable for the cooperative. Okay, so in this example, right, there was a surplus of $500, and let's say 100% of that gets turned into the patronage dividend. So what do we do with that patronage dividend functionally? What we currently do as an organization is that we distribute 20% of that to the resident owner directly at the end of the year. We send you a check. And then the remaining 80% gets put into your resident owner account. This is where there's some discretion, actually. As I mentioned with REI as an example, they don't mail you a check for your patronage dividend. They just put it as store credit for you. And that's an option. These are options too, distributing and putting it into this kind of resident owner account that you get when you leave. And the reason we do this is because there's tax benefits all around. Well, that's one of the reasons we do this. If when you distribute at least 20% of this dividend to somebody, that means that the entire 100% of the $500 becomes tax deductible. Let's say we were to distribute 0%, what that would mean is we'd keep 100% as in your resident owner account, but we would have to pay taxes on it as income to the federal government. And that tax rate is about 25%. So we'd actually be paying $125 to the government, and we'd be keeping the $500 in an account. So net, we would have, we'd only really have $375 left because we'd have paid $125 to the government, but we would still owe $500 back to the resident when they left. So this is a better deal for everybody because the resident owner gets $100 now, plus we don't have to pay any money to the government, and we get to keep $400 in our account that we then pay to the resident eventually when they leave. So this makes all the sense. We could distribute more to the residents if there's a good reason for us to do so, but it provides a lot more stability to the cooperative to keep that money in the resident owner account for the long term, especially as these things build up over time. Oh, and I just kind of described what's written down on this slide. So if you want to see it written, take a look at this. Option 1 is this distributing 0, where we have to pay taxes to the government. Option 2 is distributing 20%, where everybody wins. So let's say a resident owner is at the property for many, many years. What happens to that equity over time? So we have a resident owner account for each of our residents. And it's not like an actual bank account, but it's an accounting. It's something we keep track of. And this is just an example, a made up example of what happens if they stay at the property for 5 years. And in this middle column, new surplus and resident owner account, that shows in each year, just a very made up example of how much might they earn each year. So in this example, the first year they're earning $1,000 into their resident owner account, second year $1,100, and the third year, let's say there's a loss on the property, $500 negative. This could happen if there's a big repair that was unforeseen. Like let's say your washing machine leaks or you left your bathtub on and it runs and you got to replace your bathroom floor, right? That's going to be a big expense that wasn't foreseen, and that's going to maybe make your balance for that year negative. So negative balances get subtracted from the resident owner account as well. You can see it goes down from 2,100 all the way down to 1,600 in year three, but then it goes back up in year four and again up in year five. And so if the resident decides to leave after year five, this balance is $3,300 is actually owed to them by the cooperative. And we try to pay it right away. But again, for stability of the cooperative, we're not required to pay it right away. We give ourselves time to pay it back. And that's laid out in our bylaws how that works. Largely like up to the board decision-making process, depending on where we are financially. Like if we can't pay it back over time, we definitely have the option to extend it. And this is different from individual home ownership. When you leave your house and you sell your house as an individual owner, you obviously get paid when the sale happens, right? But because we're not actually selling your house, we're not going to be just, nobody's giving us this $3,000 for you to move out. If this really accumulates over time, this could be a lot of money. And so this example here, the numbers don't track with the next example because this was just, again, these numbers are made up and so are these numbers. So imagine this is a different resident owner with different monthly payments and different surplus building. In this example, there's a $1 million property. Let's say there's $1 million units, right? One unit, one resident owner who's paying down this $1 million loan over the course of 30 years. That's what this chart is showing, right? $1 million on the vertical axis, 30 years on the horizontal axis. And at first in yellow, you can see in year one here that it's pretty much all loan. We owe most of this $1 million and we've paid a small portion of it back. But over the course of 30 years, the red line, yeah, this line between the red and the yellow shows that by year 30, 100% of the loan is paid back. And this in blue shows the portion of it that would be earned by the resident owner as limited equity. This is 30% of the total height here of the red. And so you can see by this time, the resident owners actually earn more than $250,000, right? Because that's 30%. I guess this would be $300,000 that they'll have earned, 30% of $1 million. And so that is how much we would owe this resident at the end of 30 years if they were to decide to move out. So this is where over time, these residents really do have the opportunity to earn quite a bit of limited equity. And other limited equity cooperatives, the sort of typical California LEHC, your equity is limited to your down payment. And those down payments are typically pretty small, like $10,000 relative to a down payment for a house. And it's great that they're small. It makes it more affordable and accessible to people who don't have a lot of cash. However, it means your equity growth is only limited to that down payment plus inflation over time. And so all the monthly payments that you make after that, you don't earn any equity based off of that. So our model is very different, that there is no down payment required for resident owners. You could be an existing renter in a property that we purchase and your rent wouldn't change. You just have to sign a resident owner agreement if you want to become a resident owner. And then your existing monthly payments would start building equity in this way. But it is based on how the property is doing financially, right? If there is surplus, then you get to earn some equity. And the longer you stay in the property, the more equity you earn proportionally to that. Yeah, so that is the overview of how resident ownership works at EB PREC, how the financial benefits work at EB PREC. Definitely take a look at our resources and reach out to us if you would like to learn more or become a resident owner. Thanks so much.